She sang not because she wanted to, but because she had to, because somewhere at home, a little boy waited, his future hanging by a thread. Elena Hart believed she was invisible in the eyes of the world. But one night, under the flickering lights of a worn subway station, a stranger noticed her, a man broken in ways she couldn't yet imagine. What began with a song would grow into something neither of them had dared hope for. Their journey from loss to love is one you won't want to miss. Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. The cold bite of winter seeped through the cracked tiles of the subway station, curling around the ankles of weary commuters and clinging to the worn columns like a second skin. Amid the blur of rushing figures and the hollow roar of incoming trains, Elena Hart stood near one of the rusted pillars, her guitar case open at her feet, cradling the coins and crumpled bills of hurried passers-by. She sang quietly at first, her voice barely rising above the din, soft, unsure, but as she closed her eyes, the music took her over. Warmth bloomed inside her chest, pushing against the chill, threading itself through the underground gloom. Her voice grew clearer, purer, carrying notes of sorrow and hope that drifted through the station like threads of gold. Most people rushed past, their heads down, their minds elsewhere. But a few slowed, drawn in by something raw and honest woven into Elena's song, something that couldn't be bought or manufactured. Near the base of the pillar, huddled under her worn brown coat, Owen sat cross-legged, a small sketchbook in his lap and a battered stuffed fox tucked under one arm. He sketched absent-mindedly, his light brown hair falling into his pale, focused face. Despite the circles under his eyes and the thinness of his frame, there was a spark of fierce concentration in him, a stubborn determination that mirrored his sister's. Elena ended the song on a long, trembling note, and for a moment, the world around her seemed to hush. She opened her eyes, offering a small, tired smile to the handful of strangers who dropped coins into her case before hurrying on. Kneeling down beside Owen, she tucked a stray lock of hair behind his ear and whispered, "How's the masterpiece coming along, buddy?" Owen beamed, turning his notebook to show her a rough sketch of a snow-covered house surrounded by towering trees. In one corner, he had drawn a tiny figure holding a guitar. "It's us," he said proudly. "When we have our own place someday." Elena's throat tightened. She ruffled his hair and kissed the top of his head. "That's beautiful," she murmured. "Just like you." She helped him to his feet, slipping her guitar into its battered case. With practiced hands, she counted the money they'd earned, barely enough for tonight's groceries and Owen's next round of antibiotics. She slipped the bills into her worn backpack, taking care to hide the few larger ones deep inside. They moved carefully through the crowd, Elena keeping one hand protectively on Owen's shoulder. The streets above were even colder than the station, the wind knifing between the high buildings. She tightened her coat around her and tugged Owen's knit cap further down over his ears. Their tiny apartment was 4 blocks away, a narrow, drafty space above a closed bookstore, with creaky floors and windows that whistled when the wind blew. But it was home. It was theirs. They passed a bakery, and Owen's nose pressed to the frosted glass for a moment, his eyes lingering on the rows of warm, golden pastries. Elena squeezed his shoulder gently. "Next week," she promised. "We'll get 2 croissants. Maybe even some hot chocolate." Owen grinned, his faith in her absolute. By the time they reached their building, the last of the sunlight had faded, leaving only the sullen orange glow of street lamps. Elena unlocked the door with numb fingers, ushering Owen inside ahead of her. The apartment was chilly, but it smelled faintly of cinnamon from the half-used candle on the windowsill. Elena set down her guitar, helped Owen out of his coat, and pulled a threadbare blanket around his shoulders. "Homework first," she said, ruffling his hair again. "Then dinner." Owen groaned dramatically but obeyed, curling up on the faded couch with his workbook. Elena moved around the kitchenette, preparing a simple meal, canned soup and day-old bread. She watched Owen from the corner of her eye, her heart aching at the sight of how thin he was despite her best efforts. She worked 3 jobs, scraping by with late-night gigs at subway stations, morning shifts cleaning offices, and occasional stints at a local diner when they needed extra hands. Everything she did was for Owen, for the future she refused to let go of, no matter how many obstacles stood in their way. As they ate, Owen chattered about the story he was writing for school, an epic tale of explorers discovering a hidden forest made entirely of glass trees. Elena listened with genuine delight, laughing in all the right places, encouraging him to dream bigger, brighter. After dinner, they curled up together under the biggest blanket they owned, Elena's voice soft as she read aloud from one of Owen's favorite books. His eyes drifted closed halfway through the chapter, his hand clutching the stuffed fox tightly. Elena kissed his forehead and whispered a promise she made every night. "I'll keep singing, little star. I'll find a way." She sat in the dim light long after he fell asleep, watching the city lights flicker beyond their cracked window. Tomorrow would bring new battles, unpaid bills, frigid streets, and the constant worry that she wasn't doing enough. But for tonight, she let herself believe in the simple, stubborn power of hope. The next evening brought more of the same biting cold, the kind that seemed to settle into your bones and make the whole world feel heavier. Elena layered up, 2 sweaters under her coat, double socks, a knitted scarf her neighbor had given her last Christmas. She bundled Owen up twice as thick, helping him tuck the stuffed fox into the inner pocket of his jacket. She kissed his forehead and left him with their elderly upstairs neighbor, Mrs. Avery, who had agreed to watch him for a few hours in exchange for Elena running errands on the weekends. Owen hated staying behind, but the temperature was dropping fast, and the last thing she needed was him getting sicker. She walked quickly through the crowded streets, guitars slung over her back, heart pounding against the inside of her ribs. Not from fear, she was used to the streets, the indifferent glances, the late-night noise, but from the urgency that always lived inside her now. Time was precious. Every dollar mattered. The subway station near 5th and Main was busier tonight, the air filled with the smells of roasted chestnuts, diesel fumes, and melting snow. Elena set up in her usual spot, just beyond the main turnstiles, where the acoustics were better and the foot traffic never stopped completely. She tuned her guitar with trembling fingers, then began to play, soft at first, easing into the crowd's consciousness like a whisper at the edge of a dream. That's when Gabriel West heard her. He was crossing through the station, coat collar turned up against the cold, earbuds in his ears playing nothing but static. He liked the silence lately, or rather, the absence of anything that could make him feel. It had been years since music had touched him in any meaningful way, and he preferred it that way. Music had hurt him once, and he wasn't eager to reopen old wounds. But tonight, something made him pull the earbuds out and glance over his shoulder. At first, he thought the sound was just another street performer, another sad attempt at fame in a city drowning in broken dreams. But then he heard the note, clear, trembling, golden, and for the first time in years, he stopped walking. Elena stood beneath a flickering light, singing with her eyes closed, lost in a melody so fragile and raw that it made Gabriel's chest tighten. Her voice wasn't polished, wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was life stripped down to its barest truth. He found himself standing there, unmoving, as the people streamed around him. Her song was about winter, not the season, but the feeling. The kind of winter that crept into your heart when you lost something you couldn't get back. About holding on to a fragile flame in the darkness, even when the cold was all you could feel. Gabriel's throat tightened painfully. He realized, distantly, that his hands were clenched at his sides. When the song ended, Elena opened her eyes slowly, blinking at the crowd. She didn't seem to notice Gabriel, didn't see the way he stood apart from the others, his dark eyes fixed on her as if trying to solve a puzzle he didn't understand. Someone dropped a crumpled bill into her case. A child tugged at his mother's hand, pointing at the guitar with wide, admiring eyes. A businessman brushed past without a glance. Gabriel watched as Elena smiled gently, bowed her head in thanks, and began to pack up her things. He hesitated, torn by instincts he hadn't felt in years, the urge to approach, to say something, to acknowledge the connection that her voice had forged in the silent, wounded places inside him. But then reason caught up with emotion. He was Gabriel West, and he didn't believe in miracles anymore. So instead of walking over, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. But the melody lingered, curling around him like a half-remembered dream as he made his way home. Elena wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck as she stepped out into the cold night air. Her fingers were stiff from the hours spent playing, her back ached from standing so long, but she smiled as she glanced down at the small wad of cash in her pocket. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough for Owen's antibiotics, enough for some eggs and milk for breakfast, enough to keep their hope alive for one more day. The streets were slick with ice, the sidewalks shining under the dim glow of the streetlights. She moved carefully, her boots slipping slightly on patches of frozen slush, her mind already racing ahead to the tasks of tomorrow. When she reached the apartment, she knocked softly on Mrs. Avery's door before letting herself in. The smell of chicken soup drifted into the hallway, and Elena's heart warmed as she saw Owen curled up on the couch, a book open in his lap, his stuffed fox nestled beside him. He looked up when she entered, his face lighting up. "Did you make lots of money, Lena?" he asked eagerly. Elena laughed softly, shedding her coat and kneeling beside him. "Enough, buddy," she said. "Enough to keep us going." She ruffled his hair and kissed his forehead, relieved to feel that his temperature was normal tonight. Mrs. Avery bustled over from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "He was an angel," the old woman said with a smile. "Read his stories out loud to me all evening." "Thank you," Elena said sincerely, pressing a few bills into the woman's hand despite her protests. "You're a lifesaver." After a bit more small talk, Elena ushered Owen back upstairs to their tiny apartment. She helped him into his pajamas, listened to his latest story about a magical fox who could turn invisible, and tucked him into bed. She lingered for a long moment by his side, brushing the hair back from his forehead, her heart aching with a familiar, bittersweet mixture of love and fear. "I'll keep you safe," she whispered, the same vow she made every night. Once Owen was asleep, Elena sat by the window, sipping a cup of lukewarm tea. She stared out at the city, her thoughts drifting. She thought of the people who had dropped money into her case tonight, the tired mothers, the teenagers with backpacks, the man in the expensive suit who hadn't even noticed her, and then her mind caught on something. The man who had stopped. Not many people ever stopped. She remembered his face vaguely, tall, dark coat, strong jawline shadowed with stubble, eyes that seemed to carry a weight she recognized all too well. But he hadn't approached. He hadn't said a word. He had just stood there, listening. It wasn't much. But somehow, it mattered. Meanwhile, across the city, Gabriel West sat alone in his penthouse apartment, the lights of the city sprawling endlessly beneath his windows. He poured himself a drink, whiskey, neat, but he didn't touch it. Instead, he sat in the dark, the glass sweating onto the expensive wooden table, staring out into the night. He couldn't get her voice out of his head. It wasn't just the song. It was the raw, broken truth in it. The kind of music he hadn't heard since before. He pushed the thought away with a grimace, dragging a hand through his hair. Music had been everything to him once. The language of his soul. The blood in his veins. But after losing Emily and Jonah, after the accident that had shattered his life into pieces he couldn't put back together, he had sworn he would never let music touch him again. And yet, there she was. A girl with a second-hand guitar and eyes full of a fight he hadn't seen in a long, long time. Gabriel scowled, pushing back from the table and pacing the room restlessly. His penthouse was immaculate, lifeless, all cold glass and steel and perfectly curated emptiness. Nothing real. Nothing human. He hated how hollow it all felt tonight. Finally, with a growl of frustration, he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. He wasn't sure where he was going. He only knew he couldn't sit still anymore. The next morning, the city was coated in a thin layer of frost, the sidewalks glittering like broken glass under the weak winter sun. Elena woke early, as she always did, quietly dressing in layers to beat back the cold. She made sure Owen was still bundled up under the covers, his small body barely stirring when she kissed his forehead. She slipped out of the apartment and into the chill, her guitar case slung over one shoulder, her mind already calculating the day ahead, the diner shift later, the afternoon cleaning job, maybe another evening singing if she had the energy. At the subway station, she found her usual spot again and began to play. This time, she chose something lighter, a simple, hopeful tune that had always made Owen smile. She sang with her eyes open today, watching the world rush past her, feeling strangely more alive than she had in weeks. And that's when she saw him again. Gabriel West stood near the far wall, hands in his coat pockets, a hood pulled low over his brow. But she recognized him, the posture, the stillness, the way he wasn't moving with the crowd but standing apart, as if the world around him didn't quite touch him. For a moment, their eyes met across the sea of bodies. Elena faltered, her fingers slipping on a chord. Gabriel took a step forward, then seemed to catch himself, hesitating. A businessman brushed past him, jostling his shoulder. He barely reacted. Elena forced herself to keep playing, finishing the song with a shaky smile. When she looked up again, he was gone. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. It was stupid to care. Stupid to notice. But somehow, it mattered. She packed up quickly, her hands trembling, and headed for her afternoon shift cleaning offices downtown. Gabriel stood a block away, watching from the shadows as Elena disappeared into the crush of people. What the hell was he doing? He didn't chase singers in subway stations. He didn't chase anything anymore. That part of his life was over. But as he watched her weave through the crowd, guitar case bumping against her leg, coat pulled tight against the cold, something twisted inside him. An echo of who he used to be. A memory of what he used to believe in. He cursed under his breath and turned away, shoving his hands deeper into his pockets. But instead of heading home, he found himself wandering the city aimlessly. Past the coffee shops he used to haunt. Past the recording studios he hadn't set foot in for years. Past the tiny, forgotten corners of the city where music still lived, raw, imperfect, alive. He thought of her voice, not polished, not produced, not bent into some marketable shape, just real. Just pure. It had cut through the noise and the numbness in a way nothing else had in years. And it terrified him. That evening, Elena returned home exhausted. Owen greeted her with a sleepy hug, his latest drawing clutched in his hands. It was a picture of them again, her playing guitar, him holding his stuffed fox, but this time, there were other figures in the background. Crowds of people listening. Smiling. Believing. Elena hugged him tightly, blinking back tears. Maybe dreams weren't so impossible after all. Maybe. If she just kept singing. 2 days later, Elena set up in a different spot, closer to the older part of the subway line, where the ceilings were lower and the tiles more cracked. The crowds were thinner here, but the acoustics were better, and she needed the solace after a rough shift at the diner. Owen had developed a slight cough again, and Elena's anxiety gnawed at her with every raspy sound he made. The last thing they needed was another hospital visit they couldn't afford. She strummed the opening chords of a gentle ballad, her voice filling the underground space, weaving through the air like smoke. The station seemed to breathe with her, the echoes layering on top of her melody, turning it into something bigger than herself. She didn't see Gabriel at first. He leaned against a pillar, a few yards away, his face shadowed by his hood, hands buried deep in the pockets of his dark coat. He listened, really listened, his chest rising and falling with each note as if he were pulling her voice into himself just to feel something again. When the song ended, Elena bowed her head in thanks, but before she could pack up, a crisp envelope fluttered into her guitar case. She blinked, startled. No one she could see was close enough to have dropped it. Frowning slightly, she picked it up, heavy paper, expensive, the kind of thing you didn't find on the floor of a subway station. Inside was a note, written in a strong, deliberate hand. Some songs aren't meant for subway tunnels. Meet me tomorrow. Noon. 42nd and Park. Gabriel West. Elena stared at the signature for a long, disbelieving moment. Gabriel West. The Gabriel West. The name was a legend in the music industry, a man who had produced albums that went platinum, who had discovered artists that went on to sell out stadiums. And yet, he had vanished from the public eye years ago, after a tragedy that the tabloids had feasted on for months. What could he possibly want with her? Fear warred with curiosity in her chest. She looked around the station one more time, but if he was still there, she couldn't see him. The envelope trembled slightly in her fingers. This could be a trick. It could be a scam. It could be dangerous. But it could also be the kind of chance that only comes once in a lifetime. And if there was even a sliver of hope that it could change things for her and Owen, even a sliver, she couldn't afford to ignore it. Elena tucked the envelope carefully into her backpack, packed up her guitar, and headed home, her heart pounding wildly against her ribs. Tomorrow. Noon. 42nd and Park. Whatever happened next, her life was already changing. Meanwhile, Gabriel stood half hidden in the crowd, watching her go. His stomach twisted with doubt. What was he doing? He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready for anything. But something inside him, the part that hadn't completely withered, whispered that maybe, just maybe, he had stumbled onto something worth risking again. Something worth fighting for. He pulled his hood lower and slipped away into the night, the faint echo of her song still burning in his chest. The morning was colder than it had been in weeks, the kind of cold that seeped into your lungs and made every breath sting. Elena stood across the street from 42nd and Park, shifting her weight nervously from foot to foot, the guitar case hanging heavily from her shoulder. She almost hadn't come. All night, she had lain awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of their apartment, Owen's soft breathing the only sound in the dark. Fear gnawed at her, fear of being tricked, of being disappointed, of wanting something too much. But hope, stubborn, reckless hope, had pulled her here. The street bustled with late-morning energy. Businessmen hurried past with coffees in hand, taxis honked impatiently, and the gray sky pressed low over the city like a leaden ceiling. She scanned the crowd anxiously, her fingers tightening on the strap of her guitar case. And then she saw him. Gabriel West leaned casually against the corner of a sleek coffee shop, his coat unbuttoned despite the cold, a knit beanie pulled low over his dark hair. His hands were shoved into his pockets, and he looked uncomfortable. Restless. Like he didn't quite belong to the world moving around him. Elena hesitated for a long moment before crossing the street, weaving through the tide of pedestrians until she stood a few feet away. He noticed her instantly. Straightened slightly. Said nothing. For a heartbeat, they simply stood there, the noise of the city swirling around them like static. Finally, Gabriel spoke, his voice low and a little rough, as if he didn't use it much. You came. Elena lifted her chin, summoning every ounce of courage she had. You left me no explanation, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Just a time and place. A corner of Gabriel's mouth lifted in something that wasn't quite a smile. I figured if you were curious enough to show up, he said, maybe you're curious enough to hear me out. Elena folded her arms tightly across her chest, the guitar case bumping against her hip. I don't usually meet strange men who leave notes in my guitar case. Gabriel's eyes, a stormy gray that seemed to reflect the winter sky, met hers without flinching. I'm not here to hurt you, he said simply. I heard you sing. I think. He trailed off, as if choosing his words carefully. I think you have something special. Something real. Elena's stomach twisted painfully. She had heard words like that before, slick promises from talent scouts who wanted to use her, from agents who saw a paycheck, not a person. And every time, it had ended in disappointment. Gabriel seemed to sense her skepticism. I'm not offering you a record deal, he said bluntly. Not yet. Not anything you're not ready for. He glanced away briefly, as if the admission cost him something. I just. His voice softened. I want to hear more. Elena swallowed hard. Why me? She asked. There are 1,000 singers in this city. Gabriel gave a humorless laugh. Yeah, he said. There are. Most of them are polished. Manufactured. Shaped to fit what sells. He looked at her again, more intently now. You're not. The way he said it, not as a compliment, but as a simple, unarguable truth, made something deep inside her tremble. Before she could respond, he added, almost gruffly, lunch is on me. No strings attached. He nodded toward the coffee shop behind him. You look like you could use a hot meal. And I. He shrugged one shoulder. Could use some company that doesn't involve boardrooms and fake smiles. Elena hesitated. Everything about her screamed caution. But Owen needed her strong. And somewhere deep down, she needed, to believe there were still people in the world who didn't only take. She adjusted the guitar case on her shoulder and gave a small nod. One lunch, she said firmly. That's it. Gabriel's smile was brief but genuine. One lunch, he agreed. The cafe was warm and smelled like freshly baked bread and roasted coffee beans. It was the kind of place Elena usually only passed by, never daring to step inside. The walls were brick, the tables dark wood, and the soft hum of conversation created a cozy cocoon against the icy world outside. Gabriel chose a table near the window but tucked slightly out of sight from the street. He ordered black coffee and a sandwich without looking at the menu. Elena hesitated before choosing a modest bowl of soup and a cup of tea, acutely aware of every dollar he was about to spend. They sat in a strangely comfortable silence until the waitress left. Elena toyed with the paper napkin in front of her, her nerves frayed raw. Gabriel didn't rush her. He sat back in his chair, studying her the way someone might study a song they were trying to remember. You're scared, he said after a moment, not unkindly. She stiffened. I'm cautious, she corrected. He inclined his head slightly, conceding the point. Good. You should be. Elena bit her lip, unsure whether to be reassured or alarmed by his honesty. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice soft. Gabriel's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening slightly. Because once, he said slowly, someone took a chance on me when I had nothing. He looked out the window for a long moment, the city reflected in the glass like a ghost. And because I remember what it's like to have something inside you, something real, and not know how to protect it. Their food arrived, and they ate in silence for a few minutes. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her spoon, but she forced herself to eat. The soup was hot and rich, better than anything she'd had in weeks. Gabriel sipped his coffee, watching her carefully over the rim of his cup. You're talented, he said quietly. But talent isn't enough. Not in this city. You need someone who knows how the game is played. Someone who can teach you how to survive it without losing yourself. Elena swallowed hard. And you think that's you? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Maybe. Maybe not. But I know what happens if you try to do it alone. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. You get used up. Chewed up. Forgotten. Elena dropped her gaze to her hands, her throat tightening. She already knew that. She knew it too well. And what do you get out of it? She whispered. Why help me? Gabriel hesitated, then gave a small, almost self-deprecating shrug. Maybe I'm trying to save something in myself too. The vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, two broken people in a city that didn't care if they sank or swam. Finally, Elena pushed her empty bowl aside and folded her hands on the table. Okay, she said quietly. I'll listen. I'll hear what you have to say. Gabriel nodded, as if he had expected nothing more and nothing less. That's all I ask. The studio wasn't what Elena expected. She had pictured something sleek and glossy, filled with blinking lights and glass walls. Instead, Gabriel led her to a building tucked between a closed bookstore and an abandoned art gallery, a narrow door with peeling paint, a creaky staircase, and the faint smell of dust and old vinyl. Inside, however, the room was warm, cozy even. Mismatched rugs covered the wooden floor. A battered old piano sat in one corner, and the walls were lined with shelves crammed full of recording equipment, microphones, and tangled cords. A faint hum of electricity filled the air, as if the space itself was waiting for something to happen. "This is yours?" Elena asked, stepping inside hesitantly. Gabriel shrugged off his coat and tossed it onto a chair. "It was," he said. "A long time ago." He moved with a strange reverence through the space, his fingers trailing lightly over a soundboard as he passed. Elena watched him, sensing a history here she didn't yet understand. "Why bring me here?" she asked quietly. Gabriel turned to face her, his expression serious. "Because this is a place where you can fail," he said. "And learn. And find your voice without someone trying to shove you into a box." He nodded toward the old microphone in the center of the room. "Sing," he said simply. Elena's heart thudded painfully in her chest. "Right now?" Gabriel's mouth curved into a faint smile. "No pressure," he said dryly. "It's just me." Which somehow made it worse. Elena set down her guitar case carefully, her fingers fumbling slightly as she opened it. She pulled out her guitar, feeling the familiar weight of it steady her. She stepped up to the microphone, her palms sweating. Gabriel watched from the control booth, leaning back in the chair with his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Elena closed her eyes. She thought of Owen, of his cough last night, of the way he smiled even when he was scared. She thought of cold subway stations and late nights and promises whispered in the dark. And then she began to sing. The first few notes were shaky, but as she lost herself in the song, her voice grew stronger, weaving through the empty space with aching clarity. She sang of winter nights and flickering street lamps, of hope wrapped in tattered scarves, of love that refused to die even when the world tried to snuff it out. When she finished, there was a long, heavy silence. She opened her eyes slowly, her chest rising and falling with the effort of holding herself together. Gabriel didn't move. Didn't speak. For a moment, doubt crashed over her, sharp and cold. But then he stood, crossing the room in 3 long strides, and simply said, "That's it." Elena blinked at him. "That's what?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Gabriel's gaze was intense, burning through her like a searchlight. "That's real," he said. "No embellishment. No polish. Just truth." Elena tightened her grip on her guitar, feeling the tremble in her hands. "But is it enough?" she whispered. Gabriel's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile or something close to pain. "It's more than enough," he said quietly. "It's rare." He reached out then, almost hesitantly, as if afraid to startle her, and lightly touched the headstock of her guitar. "You don't need fixing, Elena," he said. "You need someone to fight for you." Her throat closed up. For so long, it had just been her and Owen against the world. No one had fought for her. No one had even stayed. And now this broken man, this stranger, was standing here, offering her something she hadn't dared to dream of. Not fame. Not fortune. But belief. And somehow, that was infinitely more terrifying. The afternoon light slanted through the dusty studio windows, bathing the room in soft gold. Elena sat cross-legged on the worn rug, her guitar resting across her knees, the weight of the last few hours settling into her bones. Gabriel perched on the edge of a battered leather couch a few feet away, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands. He looked tired, not just physically, but soul-deep, like a man carrying an invisible burden he didn't know how to set down. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Elena traced a finger idly along the strings of her guitar, the notes muted, almost absent-minded. Finally, she broke the silence. "You don't talk much," she said, offering him a faint, tentative smile. Gabriel huffed a breath that might have been a laugh. "Not much to say these days." She tilted her head slightly. "You used to love this," she said softly, gesturing to the room. "Music. Creating." Gabriel stared into his coffee for a long moment before answering. "I did," he said. "Once." His voice was flat, almost empty. Elena waited, sensing the fragility of the moment. Gabriel set the cup down carefully, as if the small movement required effort. "I had a family," he said at last. "A wife. A son." Elena's heart lurched painfully, but she kept her expression neutral, letting him speak. "They died," he said simply. "Car accident. 3 years ago." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The hollow spaces between his words said enough. "I'm sorry," Elena whispered, the words inadequate but true. Gabriel shrugged one shoulder, a brittle, broken movement. After that, music didn't matter anymore. Nothing did. He scrubbed a hand through his hair, his posture tense, defensive. "I disappeared. Shut everything down. Shut myself down." Elena felt a lump rise in her throat. She understood that kind of grief, not through death, maybe, but through 1,000 tiny losses. Dreams abandoned. Hopes crushed under the weight of survival. "And now?" she asked softly. Gabriel lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers across the fading light. "Now I hear a girl singing in a subway station," he said quietly. "And for the first time in 3 years, something inside me wakes up." The honesty of it left her breathless. She looked down at her hands, twisting them together in her lap. "I'm not strong," she said, almost to herself. "I'm just stubborn." Gabriel's mouth curved into a faint, genuine smile. "Sometimes stubbornness is what saves you." They sat there, two wounded souls suspended in the quiet, the city roaring on outside. After a while, Gabriel stood and crossed the room, kneeling down to rummage through a battered cabinet. He pulled out an old spiral notebook, its cover worn and faded. He flipped through the pages, then tore one out and handed it to her. A simple sheet of music. Bare bones. Rough edges. A melody unfinished. "I started writing it years ago," he said. "Couldn't finish." Elena took the page gingerly, the notes blurred slightly from what looked like water stains, or maybe tears. "I think it's yours now," Gabriel said, his voice low. Elena looked up at him, her chest tight with emotion. "But I don't know how." Gabriel shook his head. "You don't need to know," he said. "Just, sing it. Make it yours." Elena stared at the page, the faint outlines of possibility beginning to form in her mind. For the first time in a long, long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. The next few days blurred into a rhythm Elena hadn't realized she was missing, a rhythm of music, of shared silences, of hesitant trust slowly threading its way between her and Gabriel like an unseen current. Every afternoon after her cleaning shifts, she would slip into the studio. Gabriel would already be there, tinkering with the soundboard or lost in thought at the piano. He didn't hover, didn't push. He simply created space for her, a rare, precious thing. Together, they worked on the old melody he had given her. Elena added lyrics, tentative at first, then with growing boldness. She shaped the song with her voice, breathing life into the bones Gabriel had abandoned years ago. He listened carefully, offering small suggestions but never forcing. He treated her ideas like something sacred, and in doing so, gave her a confidence she hadn't known she possessed. It wasn't perfect. There were moments of frustration, of fear. But there was laughter too, the kind that caught her off guard and left her light-headed with its rarity. And slowly, Elena began to remember what it felt like to dream without fear. One evening, after a long session in the studio, Gabriel offered to walk her home. It was snowing, soft, feathery flakes that blurred the edges of the city into something almost beautiful. They walked in silence, Elena clutching her guitar case, Gabriel matching his pace to hers. When they reached her building, Elena hesitated at the foot of the stoop. "Do you want to come up?" she asked, surprising herself. Gabriel's brows lifted slightly, and she hurried to clarify. "Just to meet Owen," she said quickly. "He's been asking about the man who buys me soup and listens to me sing." Gabriel's mouth curved into a real smile, warm and a little shy. "I'd like that," he said simply. Inside, Owen was waiting by the window, his stuffed fox clutched tight in his arms. He brightened immediately when he saw Elena and the stranger behind her. "You're Mr. Gabriel," he declared proudly, as if he had known him all along. Gabriel chuckled, crouching down to Owen's level. "Just Gabriel," he said. "Nice to meet you, buddy." Owen eyed him critically for a moment, then solemnly offered him the stuffed fox. "You can hold him if you want," he said. "He's lucky." Gabriel accepted the fox with surprising gentleness, cradling it awkwardly in his large hands. "Thank you," he said gravely. "I could use some luck." Elena watched them, her throat tightening with emotion she couldn't quite name. They sat together on the worn couch, Owen chattering animatedly about his drawings and his stories, Gabriel listening with the same quiet intensity he gave to music. For the first time in what felt like forever, their tiny apartment felt less like a place they were surviving in, and more like a home. Later, after Owen had fallen asleep on the couch mid-story, Gabriel helped Elena tuck him into bed. They stood in the dim light of the living room, the snow still falling softly outside the window. "Thank you," Elena said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel shook his head. "No," he said. "Thank you. For letting me be part of this." He hesitated, then added, almost shyly. "It's been a long time since I've been around anything real." Elena looked up at him, her heart aching. "You are real," she said softly. "You just forgot." For a moment, Gabriel simply stared at her, something raw and unguarded flickering across his face. Then he reached out, slowly, carefully, and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. It was the barest touch. But it felt like the beginning of something enormous. Something neither of them dared to name yet. The tiny cafe at the corner of Lexington and 89th didn't look like much from the outside, just a chipped green door, a battered awning sagging under the weight of last week's snow. But inside, it was warm, dimly lit by strings of fairy lights, the walls covered in mismatched art and old concert posters. The perfect place to be invisible. Or so Elena hoped. She sat at a corner table with her guitar across her lap, her hands trembling slightly despite the warmth of the room. Owen sat beside her, swinging his legs anxiously, the battered stuffed fox clutched in his lap. Gabriel stood by the counter, speaking quietly to the owner, a woman with silver hair and a smile that suggested she had seen too many struggling musicians to be easily impressed. She glanced at Elena once, nodded, and scribbled something into a battered notebook. Gabriel returned to their table, sliding into the seat opposite her. "You're on after the next set," he said, his voice low and calm. Elena swallowed hard, her stomach twisting. "I'm not ready," she said, panic rising in her chest. Gabriel shook his head. "You're more ready than you think." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the scarred wood of the table. "Just one song," he said. "That's all. One song. For you. For him." He nodded slightly toward Owen. Elena glanced at her brother, who beamed up at her with complete, unwavering faith. Her throat tightened. She could do this. She had to. The current performer, a man in a worn denim jacket with a harmonica around his neck, finished his last song to a polite smattering of applause. The silver-haired woman crossed the room with surprising speed, tapping Elena lightly on the shoulder. "You're up, sweetheart," she said. Elena rose on shaky legs, gripping her guitar like a lifeline. Gabriel squeezed her hand briefly as she passed. "You've got this," he murmured. The small stage was barely elevated, just a few inches of plywood laid over crates, but as Elena stepped onto it, the world seemed to tilt. The crowd wasn't large. Maybe 20 people, most of them hunched over cups of coffee or plates of pie. A few looked up curiously. One or two barely glanced her way. But that was enough. The microphone squeaked as she adjusted it. She took a deep breath, willing her hands to stop trembling. Then she began to play. The first chords were soft, tentative, barely audible over the low murmur of conversation. But then her voice rose, thin and quivering at first, then stronger, richer, like a river breaking free of winter ice. A hush fell over the room. Heads turned. Conversation stilled. Elena closed her eyes, letting the music carry her, letting the words she'd written from scraps of broken dreams weave a net to catch her. She sang of quiet hopes, of battles fought in silence, of tiny victories and stubborn survival. When she finished, the last note trembling in the smoky air, there was a moment of profound stillness. Then, slowly, almost shyly, the room erupted into applause. Not thunderous. Not overwhelming. But real. Elena opened her eyes, blinking back tears. She spotted Gabriel in the crowd, standing near the back, his expression unreadable, except for the faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. And Owen, clapping enthusiastically from his seat, his face alight with pride. Elena stepped down from the stage, her heart hammering against her ribs, her skin buzzing with adrenaline. Gabriel met her halfway, his hand steady as he touched her shoulder. "You were incredible," he said simply. Elena laughed, half in disbelief, half in sheer relief. "I didn't faint," she said breathlessly. Gabriel's smile deepened. "No," he said. "You flew." After that night, everything changed. Not all at once. Not with some grand, sweeping gesture. But with the quiet, persistent way that water wears down stone, slowly, inevitably. The owner of the cafe, whose name turned out to be Martha, asked Elena if she would come back the following Friday. "Same time," Martha said, scribbling it into her battered notebook. "You bring in the right kind of crowd." Gabriel said nothing, just smiled quietly to himself as he walked Elena and Owen home through the snow. The next performance was easier. The one after that, easier still. Word began to spread, not quickly, but steadily, like a rumor whispered between friends. A girl with a guitar and a voice you couldn't forget. Raw. Honest. Real. Sometimes new faces appeared at the back of the room, young men in sharp suits, women in sleek black coats with expensive boots, clutching phones and notebooks. Talent scouts. Agents. People who smelled of money and opportunity. Gabriel watched them all carefully, his jaw tight, his arms folded across his chest whenever one of them tried to approach Elena after a set. He didn't interfere, not yet. But Elena felt his silent warning every time she caught his eye. Be careful. One night, after a particularly strong set where Elena sang one of the original songs they had been working on together, a woman in a deep burgundy coat approached her. "Elena Hart?" she asked, flashing a blinding white smile. Elena wiped her palms on her jeans, her heart hammering. "Yes." The woman handed her a sleek business card, heavy stock, embossed lettering. Serena Blackwell. Talent Management, Blackwell Entertainment Group. "I'd love to chat with you sometime," Serena said smoothly. "You've got a rare gift. Natural. Raw. Authentic. The kind of sound labels are desperate for right now." Elena blinked at the card, unsure what to say. Serena's smile widened, predatory and perfect. Think about it, she said. Opportunity doesn't wait forever. With a wink and a swish of her coat, she disappeared into the night. Elena stood frozen, the card burning a hole in her hand. Gabriel appeared at her side a moment later, his face unreadable. Who was that? He asked, his voice deceptively casual. Someone, interested, Elena said uncertainly. Gabriel's jaw flexed. Be careful, he said again, softer this time. Not everyone who offers you a hand is trying to help you up. Elena nodded slowly, slipping the card into her coat pocket. But deep inside, a flicker of something dangerous and exciting had been lit. Hope. Possibility. Maybe, escape. Maybe a better life for Owen. For both of them. Gabriel watched her, and though he said nothing more, Elena could feel the distance growing between them like a crack in ice. Neither of them was ready to name it yet. But it was there. And it was only getting wider. The next day was gray and wet, the kind of day when the city itself seemed to sag under the weight of its own exhaustion. Elena spent the morning scrubbing office floors until her hands were raw and her shoulders ached. By the time she arrived at the studio, she was soaked to the skin, her hair clinging to her cheeks in damp strands. Gabriel was already there, tuning an old acoustic guitar he had found somewhere in the cluttered back room. He looked up when she entered, frowning. You're drenched. Elena shrugged off her coat, wringing out the hem with a grimace. Had to work, she said simply. Gabriel set the guitar aside and crossed the room, grabbing a towel from a stack near the door. He handed it to her wordlessly. She accepted it, drying her hair and face as best she could. For a few minutes, they moved around each other in silence, him fiddling with cables, her warming her fingers against the small space heater near the window. Finally, Gabriel spoke. I saw you talking to that woman last night. Elena stiffened slightly. She gave me her card, she said carefully. Said she could help. Gabriel nodded slowly. And are you thinking about it? Elena hesitated. Part of her wanted to lie, to tell him no, to tell him she trusted him completely, that she wasn't tempted. But that would have been a betrayal of everything that had ever kept her and Owen alive, honesty. Brutal, necessary honesty. I don't know, she said quietly. Maybe. Gabriel leaned back against the old piano, folding his arms across his chest. I can't stop you, he said. I won't try. Elena blinked, surprised by the resignation in his voice. But you should know, he continued, his voice low and rough, people like that, they see you as a commodity. Not a person. Not a story. Just a sound they can sell. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, feeling suddenly cold despite the heater. I know, she said. I'm not stupid. Gabriel's mouth twisted in something that might have been frustration or regret. I didn't say you were. He pushed off the piano and began pacing the small space, restless energy rolling off him. I just. He stopped, raking a hand through his hair. I don't want to see you get hurt. Used up. He turned to face her then, his eyes dark and fierce. You're different, Elena. You still believe in something. Elena met his gaze steadily, her heart pounding. And what about you? She asked softly. What do you believe in? Gabriel froze. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, almost too quietly to hear, he whispered. You. The word hung between them, fragile and terrifying. Elena swallowed hard, feeling the weight of it settle into her bones. Gabriel. She began, but he shook his head. You don't owe me anything, he said roughly. I'm not asking for loyalty. I'm not asking for anything. He stepped closer, until there was only a breath of space between them. I just want you to be careful, he said. And to remember who you are before they tell you who they want you to be. Elena looked up at him, her chest tight with unshed emotions. I don't want to lose myself, she whispered. Gabriel's hand lifted, hesitated, then gently touched her cheek, a brief, feather-light caress that made her eyes sting. "Then don't," he said. They stood there for a long, breathless moment, the city's noise a distant hum outside the walls. Finally, Elena stepped back, breaking the spell. "I need to think," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Gabriel nodded once, the muscle in his jaw twitching. "I'll be here," he said simply. And somehow, Elena knew he meant it, not just for today, or tomorrow, but for as long as she needed. She slipped out into the rain, the door closing softly behind her. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure which scared her more. The possibility of failure. Or the terrifying, wonderful possibility of something more. The rain didn't let up. It pounded against the streets in sheets, turning sidewalks into rivers, soaking through coats and boots within minutes. Elena wandered aimlessly, Owen's worn hoodie pulled up over her hair, Gabriel's words echoing in her mind like a song she couldn't forget. "Remember who you are before they tell you who they want you to be." She found herself at a bus stop, staring blankly at the schedule without seeing it. People bustled past, umbrellas colliding, curses muttered under breath. The city didn't care about her crossroads, her hopes, her fears. She pulled Serena Blackwell's business card from her pocket, turning it over in her fingers. A better life for Owen. A warm apartment. Regular medicine. New shoes that didn't pinch his growing feet. It would be so easy to call. So easy. Elena slipped the card back into her pocket and caught the first bus headed uptown. Not home. Not yet. She needed to think. When she returned to the apartment late that night, Owen was asleep on the couch, the TV flickering quietly in the background. Gabriel was there too, sitting in the worn armchair by the window, his head bowed, fingers steepled in front of his mouth. He looked up when she entered. Relief flashed across his face, quickly masked. "I was starting to worry," he said quietly. Elena shrugged out of her soaked hoodie, hanging it over the radiator to dry. "I needed some air." Gabriel nodded, accepting the explanation without pressing. She sank onto the couch beside Owen, brushing a hand over his hair. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Gabriel broke the silence. "Did you call her?" Elena shook her head slowly. "I thought about it," she admitted. "Really thought about it." She looked up at him then, her eyes shining with emotion. "But then I remembered, the way you look at me when I sing. Like it means something. Like I mean something." Gabriel's throat bobbed visibly. "You do," he said roughly. Elena smiled, a small, trembling smile. "I'm not ready to sell that," she said. "Not yet." Gabriel exhaled a long, shaky breath and crossed the room in 2 strides. He sat beside her, careful not to wake Owen, and took her hand in his, rough, calloused fingers curling gently around hers. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "And you're more scared than you admit," she replied softly, squeezing his hand. Gabriel laughed quietly, no bitterness in it, just bone-deep exhaustion and a hint of wonder. "Maybe we're both a little broken," he said. "Maybe that's what makes us fit," Elena whispered. They sat there, 2 imperfect people clinging to the fragile, stubborn thread of hope they had woven between them. The storm raged outside, but inside the tiny apartment, there was warmth. There was music. There was something new, something fierce and fragile all at once. The beginning of a new song neither of them knew the words to yet. But one they were willing to learn together. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the storm having scrubbed the city clean for once. Sunlight poured through the cracked windows, glinting off puddles on the street, making everything look new, raw, but alive. Elena woke early, Owen still curled beside her under their shared quilt, his small hand resting trustingly against her side. She lay still for a moment, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, feeling the fragile peace that had settled over their tiny apartment. She knew it wouldn't last forever. Nothing ever did. But maybe, Just maybe, they could build something real before the world tried to tear it down again. When she slipped into the kitchen, she found Gabriel already there, shirt rumpled, barefoot, 2 mugs of coffee steaming on the counter. He handed her one without a word. They stood in companionable silence, sipping the bitter warmth, the city stretching out before them like a promise. Finally, Gabriel spoke. "There's a showcase next month," he said, his voice low and careful. "Small. Real musicians. No industry sharks. No contracts. Just music." Elena arched an eyebrow over her cup. "And you think I should play?" Gabriel smiled faintly. "I think you should be heard." Elena considered it. Not a contract. Not a shortcut to fame. Just a room full of strangers and a microphone, and her heart cracked open for anyone willing to listen. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was honest. She set her cup down and met his gaze squarely. "Okay," she said. Gabriel's smile deepened, warm and a little disbelieving, like a man who had stopped expecting good things but was slowly remembering how to hope. "We'll do it your way," he said. "No compromises. No pretending." Elena nodded, feeling something inside her settle into place, a click, like a key turning in a long-rusted lock. She wasn't chasing dreams anymore. She was building them. Slowly. Stubbornly. With people who saw her, really saw her, and chose to stay. Owen wandered sleepily into the kitchen a few minutes later, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand. Gabriel ruffled his hair as he passed, and Owen grinned up at him, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And maybe it was. Maybe family wasn't always blood and papers and promises. Maybe sometimes it was built note by note, moment by moment, through the quiet, fierce decision to keep showing up for each other. Elena looked at the two of them, this unlikely, patchwork little life they were stitching together, and felt a surge of fierce gratitude. The road ahead would be hard. She knew that. There would be doubts. There would be failures. There would be storms they hadn't even begun to imagine. But for the first time in a long, long time, she wasn't afraid. The showcase was only 2 weeks away. 2 weeks. 14 days. 336 hours. Elena counted them like beads on a rosary, each one slipping through her fingers faster than she could grasp it. Every spare moment was spent in the studio now. Gabriel had shifted their practices into something more structured, warming up her voice, running scales, teaching her tricks to control her breathing under pressure. His methods were sharp but never cruel, his patience unwavering even when her nerves frayed to the breaking point. Owen came with her most days, curling up in a worn armchair with his sketchbook and stuffed fox, offering the occasional wide-eyed suggestion like, "Maybe sing it like you're telling a story to me, Lena." And somehow, that always worked better than any technical advice. Still, fear coiled low in Elena's stomach, tightening with every hour that passed. This was different than the cafe. This wasn't 20 distracted customers half listening over their coffee. This would be a real audience. Real expectations. Real chances, and real risks. And hovering at the edges of it all was Serena Blackwell, who had appeared twice now at the cafe after Elena's sets, always smiling, always patient, always, just checking in. Gabriel hadn't said anything about her appearances. He didn't have to. His tense jaw and stormy eyes spoke volumes. Elena tried to push the distractions aside. She focused on the music, the lyrics, the way Gabriel's guitar harmonized with hers when they practiced late into the night. She reminded herself, over and over. I'm doing this for Owen. For myself. Not for anyone else. But doubt was a clever thing. It knew how to slip through the cracks when she was tired. It whispered in her ear when she was alone. It painted pictures of failure so vividly she could taste them. One night, a week before the showcase, Elena broke. They had been practicing for hours, the clock ticking past midnight, the city outside swallowed by fog. She missed a chord progression, stumbled over her words, and finally dropped her guitar into her lap with a choked sob. "I can't do this," she whispered, her throat closing. Gabriel was across the room in an instant, crouching in front of her, his hand steady on her shaking knees. "Hey," he said softly. "Look at me." Elena shook her head, blinking back furious tears. "I'm not good enough," she rasped. "I'm just a girl who sings in subways. I'm not what they want." Gabriel's fingers tightened slightly, grounding her. "You're right," he said. Elena froze, stunned. Gabriel smiled, a slow, crooked thing that warmed her from the inside out. "You're not what they want," he said. "You're what they need. They just don't know it yet." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "And if you walk out there next week and sing the way you did that first night, raw and scared and real, you won't just be another girl with a guitar. You'll be the one they remember when the lights go down." Elena's chest ached with the weight of his belief. "I'm scared," she whispered. Gabriel nodded, his thumb brushing a stray tear from her cheek. "Good," he said. "It means it matters." They sat like that for a long moment, the hum of the old amp filling the quiet, the city breathing faintly beyond the window. Finally, Elena drew a deep, shuddering breath and straightened her spine. "Okay," she said. "Let's go again." Gabriel's smile deepened, full of pride he didn't try to hide. "That's my girl," he said. And this time, when Elena picked up her guitar and sang, her voice didn't shake. It soared. The final week slipped past in a blur. Each day brought a little more strength, a little more certainty. Elena worked until her voice was raw, until her fingers ached from the strings. Gabriel was there for all of it, sometimes pushing, sometimes pulling back, always knowing when to demand more and when to simply sit with her in the quiet, letting her breathe. Owen made posters out of construction paper and crayons, proudly declaring, "My sister is a star." They taped one of them to the wall of the studio, right above the battered old soundboard. Gabriel didn't say anything about it, but Elena caught him looking at it more than once with a strange, softened expression. 2 days before the showcase, Elena finished a run-through and collapsed onto the couch, sweat damp and exhausted but grinning. "I didn't mess up once," she said, amazed. Gabriel tossed her a water bottle and smirked. "You're dangerous now." She laughed, the sound light and real. For a moment, there was nothing in the world but that, music, laughter, the warm golden glow of something beginning. And then the knock came. Sharp. Insistent. Gabriel's expression darkened instantly. He crossed the room and opened the door without hesitation. Serena Blackwell stood on the threshold, dressed in an immaculately tailored coat and heeled boots that clicked against the studio's worn floors as she stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Her eyes landed on Elena, assessing, calculating. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said smoothly. "Just to offer an opportunity." Gabriel's stance was tense, protective. Elena stood slowly, wiping her hands on her jeans. "What kind of opportunity?" she asked, her voice steady. Serena smiled, all polish and poison. "My client list includes 3 artists nominated for Grammys this year," she said, slipping a glossy folder from her bag and placing it on the table between them. "I can have you signed, recorded, and booked on a tour within 6 months." Elena's heart kicked hard against her ribs. Tour. Recordings. Money. Security for Owen. A real future. All of it, right there, so close she could almost touch it. But when she glanced at Gabriel, she saw the warning in his eyes. Not because he didn't believe in her. Because he knew what a price tags they would slap onto her soul the second she signed her name. Serena saw the hesitation and pressed the advantage. "You have something special, Elena," she said, her voice soft, coaxing. "But the world moves fast. Blink, and the opportunity is gone. Elena's fingers brushed the edge of the folder. It would be so easy. So terribly, seductively easy. She thought of Owen. Of Gabriel. Of the studio walls that smelled like dust and hope. Of every night spent singing to strangers, clinging to a dream with bloody hands. And she thought of herself. The girl who had sung in a subway station not to be discovered. But to survive. To stay real. To stay whole. Slowly, Elena pulled her hand back. She met Serena's sharp, expectant gaze and said. No. A flicker of something, surprise. Disappointment. Passed over Serena's face before she smoothed it away. Think carefully, she said. Opportunities like this don't come twice. Elena smiled, small and fierce. Then I guess I'll have to make my own. Serena hesitated, clearly unused to being refused. Then, with a graceful shrug, she gathered her folder and left without another word. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving only the quiet hum of the studio's old heater. Gabriel stared at Elena for a long moment. Then he crossed the room in 2 strides, cupped her face in his hands, and pressed his forehead gently to hers. I'm so damn proud of you, he whispered. Tears blurred Elena's vision, but she laughed, breathless, giddy, triumphant. For the first time, the future didn't terrify her. It waited, wide open. And she was ready. The night before the showcase, Elena couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned on the worn couch, the blanket twisted around her legs, her mind racing in circles she couldn't escape. Every possible disaster played out behind her closed eyelids, forgotten lyrics, broken guitar strings, the audience sitting in stony silence. Finally, she gave up. She pulled on a sweater and tiptoed out into the living room, careful not to wake Owen. The little boy mumbled something in his sleep, clutching his stuffed fox tighter. Elena smiled softly and closed the door behind her. The city was almost eerily quiet at this hour, the deep silence of 3 in the morning, when even the traffic surrendered to exhaustion. She climbed the stairs to the roof, the old fire escape groaning beneath her weight. The air was sharp and cold, but clear. Above her, the stars fought bravely against the glow of the city lights. She stood there for a long time, arms wrapped around herself, breathing in the biting air and trying to steady the wild gallop of her heart. She heard the creak of the escape before she saw him. Gabriel. He didn't say anything as he joined her, just offered the thermos he held in his hand. Elena took it gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the warm metal. Hot chocolate. Of course. Somehow, Gabriel always knew. They stood side by side in the silence, the city sprawling endlessly below them. You okay? He asked after a while, his voice low. Elena laughed quietly, no real humor in it. Terrified, she admitted. Gabriel nodded, as if he'd expected nothing less. You should be, he said. It means you care. She glanced at him, his profile sharp against the night sky. Did you ever get scared? She asked. Gabriel's mouth twitched into a half-smile. Every damn time, he said. Even when I pretended I didn't. He took a sip from his own thermos, then added. The trick isn't not being scared. It's doing it anyway. Elena exhaled slowly, watching her breath curl in the cold air. I'm afraid of failing, she whispered. Gabriel turned to face her fully then, his expression serious. You're not going to fail. She shook her head. You can't know that. Gabriel smiled, small, steady, unshakable. Yes, I can. He reached out and touched her chin lightly, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. Because even if every note falls flat, even if no one claps, even if you forget every word, you'll still be standing there, telling your truth. And that, he said, his voice fierce, is never failure. Elena blinked rapidly, swallowing the lump in her throat. I don't know if I'm strong enough, she whispered. Gabriel's hand slid from her chin to cup her cheek, his palm warm against her cold skin. "You are," he said simply. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to just them. The rooftop, the stars, the unspoken promises hanging between them. And in that space, Elena found a strength she hadn't known she had. Not because Gabriel gave it to her. Because he reminded her it had always been there. She smiled through her tears, leaning briefly into his hand. "Thank you," she said. Gabriel dropped his forehead to hers, his breath warm against her skin. "Always," he whispered. They stayed like that for a long moment, the city humming softly beneath them. And when they finally pulled apart, something unbreakable had settled between them. Not a confession. Not a demand. Just a quiet, burning understanding. They were in this together. No matter what. The showcase was held in a converted theater downtown, an old building with velvet seats and faded gold trim, the kind of place where you could still feel the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten performances whispering through the rafters. Elena stood backstage, her guitar strapped across her back, her hands trembling so badly she could barely tune the strings. The other performers milled around her, confident, polished, already belonging to a world she still wasn't sure she was ready to step into. Owen sat in the front row with Mrs. Avery, the neighbor who had agreed to babysit him in case things ran late. He waved at Elena every time she peeked through the curtain, his grin so wide it made her heart ache. Gabriel stood near the soundboard, arms folded, a quiet, immovable force. He caught her eye across the room and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You can do this. You're ready." Elena clutched that silent message to her chest like armor as the announcer's voice boomed overhead. "Next up, Elena Hart." Her legs nearly buckled. But somehow, she moved. The stage lights were blinding, the auditorium stretching out before her like a yawning mouth. For a dizzying second, she couldn't breathe. Then she remembered Owen's smile. Gabriel's steady gaze. The countless nights in the subway, singing to no one and everyone. The first note slipped from her lips, tentative, trembling, and then another, and another, until the song unfolded around her like a fragile bird finally taking flight. She sang of cold nights and warm hopes, of losing everything and daring to believe anyway. She sang of fear and stubbornness and the quiet, ferocious love that had kept her standing when everything else had fallen apart. She didn't sing perfectly. Her voice cracked once, raw with emotion. Her fingers stumbled over a chord. But none of it mattered. Because every note, every word, every breath was real. When she finished, the last chord trembling in the air, there was a moment of pure, crystalline silence. Then the room erupted. Not a polite smattering of applause. Not forced. Real. Honest. The kind of applause that filled her up and broke her open all at once. Elena bowed her head, blinking back tears. As she walked off stage, the lights hot on her skin, she didn't look at the talent scouts lining the back wall, their phones already buzzing with notes and offers. She looked for Owen, who jumped up and down, clapping wildly. She looked for Gabriel, who stood exactly where he had promised he would be, his smile quiet and fierce and so full of pride it stole the breath from her lungs. And she realized. This was only the beginning. Not of fame. Not of fortune. But of something far more precious. A life she had built with her own bruised hands. A song she had written note by trembling note. A melody the world hadn't been waiting for. But one it needed all the same. After the showcase, the offers came in a flood. Agents. Managers. Labels. Some offered money, more than Elena had ever seen written on a check. Some dangled promises of radio play, magazine covers, European tours. Some barely looked at her, addressing their pitches to Gabriel as if she were just another product to be packaged and sold. Gabriel deflected most of them without Elena ever knowing. He let her bask, for a few precious days, in the simple glow of having stood on that stage and been enough. But eventually, reality pressed in. They sat together in the studio one evening, the city humming low and restless outside, a stack of business cards fanned across the table between them. Elena stared at them, heart pounding. "So many," she whispered. Gabriel leaned back in his chair, studying her with that calm, steady gaze that had become her anchor. "You don't have to pick any of them," he said. Elena looked at him, startled. "But, isn't that the point?" Gabriel shrugged. "The point is your music. Your voice. Your story." He tapped one of the cards, a sleek, expensive thing from Blackwell Entertainment Group. "They'll want to change you," he said. "Make you fit a mold." He tapped another. "They'll tell you they know better." Another. "They'll smile while they gut you." Elena exhaled shakily. "And if I don't pick any of them?" she asked. "If I just stay here?" Gabriel smiled, soft and a little sad. "Then we keep playing. Keep building. Your way." He leaned forward, his voice low and fierce. "You're not a product, Elena. You're a miracle. Don't let them convince you otherwise." Elena blinked rapidly, swallowing the lump rising in her throat. She thought of Owen's drawings taped to the studio wall. Of Gabriel's hand steadying hers when she faltered. Of the sound of her own voice filling the old theater, raw and imperfect and alive. She smiled. Slowly, surely. And she swept the cards into the trash. Gabriel's smile widened, something fierce and bright sparking in his eyes. Owen burst into the studio then, his arms full of construction paper and crayons, and Elena laughed, a sound so pure it made Gabriel's heart ache in the best possible way. They spent the evening planning, not world tours, not record deals, but a small local concert. A benefit show to raise money for the community center that had offered Elena her first real stage. A beginning. On their terms. In the only way that mattered. Together. The old community center wasn't much to look at, chipped bricks, a sagging roof, paint peeling from the wooden front doors. But inside, it felt alive. The kind of place built from donated chairs, hand-me-down stage lights, and the stubborn dreams of people who refused to give up. It was perfect. Exactly where Elena wanted to begin again. The night of the concert, the small auditorium filled quickly. Neighbors, friends, people from the cafe who had followed her journey, all crammed into the folding chairs, buzzing with quiet excitement. Owen was everywhere at once, helping tape up hand-drawn posters, "Tonight, Elena Hart Live." One night only, and handing out homemade programs he had designed himself. Gabriel stayed mostly behind the scenes, making sure the sound system, donated by an old friend from his forgotten music days, was patched together enough to work. When Elena peeked through the dusty backstage curtains, she felt her heart expand to the point of bursting. This wasn't a crowd looking for perfection. This wasn't about money or fame or contracts. This was about community. About survival. About choosing hope, again and again, even when it would be easier to stop. Gabriel came to stand beside her, his presence steady and grounding. "You ready?" he asked. Elena smiled at him, not a nervous smile, not a forced one. A real one. "I'm ready," she said. She stepped out onto the small stage, her guitar slung across her body, the old mic squealing once before settling into silence. The lights were dim, the room intimate, the audience close enough to see the way her fingers trembled as she adjusted the mic. She took a deep breath, found Gabriel's face in the crowd, and Owen's, sitting front row center, practically vibrating with pride, and began. The first chords rolled out, simple and sure. She sang the songs she had written in subway tunnels and empty kitchens. Songs about broken dreams stitched together with stubborn hope. Songs about loss and finding pieces of yourself in unexpected places. And the audience listened, really listened, leaning forward, breathing with her, rising and falling on every note. It wasn't perfect. It was better. It was real. When she finished, the room exploded into applause so loud it rattled the cracked windows. Tears burned Elena's eyes as she bowed, laughter bubbling up inside her chest. She wasn't alone anymore. She had never really been. As the applause died down, Elena handed her guitar carefully to a volunteer at the side of the stage and leaned into the microphone once more, her voice shaking slightly, not with fear this time, but with something much more fragile and pure. "I have one more performer to introduce tonight," she said, her smile trembling at the corners. "Someone who's been my biggest fan, my bravest cheerleader, and my little brother." A soft ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Owen, blushing furiously, climbed onto the stage with Mrs. Avery's help, clutching a small ukulele almost as big as he was. Elena knelt down beside him, adjusting the strap gently over his shoulder. "You ready, little star?" she whispered. Owen nodded fiercely, his eyes wide but determined. She handed him the microphone, which someone had thoughtfully lowered to his height. Owen cleared his throat, a serious, businesslike sound, and plucked out a few tentative notes. The song was simple, a tiny, wobbly version of the lullaby Elena used to hum to him when the nights were too cold and the dark felt too big. He missed a chord. Forgot a line. Giggled halfway through and had to start over. And the audience loved him for it. By the time he strummed the final note, the entire room was on its feet, cheering loud enough to make the rafters shake. Elena swept him into her arms, spinning him around as he laughed breathlessly into her shoulder. "You were amazing," she whispered into his ear. "You too, Lena," he whispered back. "You're the best." She carried him off stage, his arms wrapped tight around her neck, his stuffed fox dangling from one hand. Gabriel was waiting in the wings, smiling in that rare, unguarded way that made Elena's knees go weak. He ruffled Owen's hair as they passed. "You crushed it, kiddo," he said. Owen beamed and immediately launched into a detailed recap of his performance for Mrs. Avery, leaving Elena and Gabriel alone for a moment behind the heavy stage curtains. The applause still thundered in the background, but here, in this narrow strip of shadow and light, there was only him, and her, and the beating of her heart so loud she thought surely he could hear it. Gabriel reached out slowly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "You did it," he said softly. Elena laughed, breathless. "No," she said. "We did it." Gabriel's hand lingered against her cheek, his thumb tracing a feather-like line along her skin. The air between them crackled with something electric and inevitable. For one suspended heartbeat, they just stood there, all the things they hadn't said shimmering between them like notes of an unfinished song. And then, finally, Elena rose onto her toes, her hands fisting lightly in the front of his jacket, and kissed him. It was not a perfect kiss. It was tentative, searching, trembling at the edges. But it was real. Honest. Exactly like them. Gabriel froze for a moment, startled, breath caught, and then he kissed her back, his hands cradling her face as if she were something precious and fragile and fiercely, stubbornly alive. When they pulled apart, Elena's forehead rested against his, both of them laughing softly, breathlessly. "I'm scared," she admitted. Gabriel smiled. "Me too," he said. And somehow, that made it perfect. The crowd was still buzzing when Elena and Gabriel stepped back into the main room, Owen proudly marching ahead of them with his ukulele slung over one shoulder like a seasoned performer. Neighbors clapped them on the back, volunteers pressed cups of cider into their hands, and Mrs. Avery wiped at her eyes with the hem of her sweater, claiming she had something in her eye. Someone pulled Elena aside for a quick photo, an old Polaroid camera flashing a too bright burst of light that left spots dancing in her vision. Someone else slipped a folded 20 into her hand, whispering, "For the music. For the hope." It was messy and chaotic and utterly beautiful. The kind of night you didn't realize was a beginning until much, much later. Later, when the chairs had been stacked and the lights dimmed, they sat together in a loose circle on the stage, Elena, Gabriel, Owen, Mrs. Avery, and a few others who had stayed behind to help. Gabriel tuned his guitar lazily, his fingers moving out of habit more than purpose. Elena leaned back on her elbows, her legs stretched out in front of her, feeling more at peace than she had in years. "I think we should do this again," Owen declared around a mouthful of leftover cupcake. Everyone laughed. Elena reached over and brushed a crumb from his chin. "I think we should," she agreed. Gabriel looked at her then, really looked at her, and something unspoken passed between them. Not just about music. Not just about dreams. But about building a life. Together. Outside, the first snow of the new year had begun to fall, tiny, tentative flakes swirling in the crisp night air. Gabriel stood and held out a hand to Elena. She took it without hesitation, letting him pull her to her feet. They walked outside into the quiet hush of falling snow, Owen skipping ahead of them, leaving wild, lopsided footprints in his wake. Elena tilted her face up to the sky, letting the snow kiss her cheeks, feeling the cold sink into her skin and the warmth bloom even deeper inside her chest. Gabriel's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally, easily. No rush. No promises they weren't ready to make yet. Just this. This moment. This beginning. Together, they stepped forward into the night, their laughter rising like music into the dark, star-swept sky. And somewhere, deep inside her, Elena knew. The melody they had found, broken, stubborn, beautiful, was only just beginning.